Should we start? Okay. Yeah, welcome everyone, and thanks for being with us for the latest installment in our lecture series on evidence, models, and explanation. Today we have with us Nilanjan Das from University College London. Nilanjan works on Indian philosophy and also on epistemology. Today we're going to hear from him on epistemology. Specifically, he's going to present to us a talk regarding a puzzle about bias. We'll have Nilanjan's talk for, let's say, 45 minutes to an hour, somewhere around that length. And then we'll open it up to questions from all of you. So please stay with us for the discussion period after the talk. All right. Thank you very much. Go ahead, Nilanjan.
Okay, I will be, so here's, I'm going to share in the chat box a link for my slides, but I will be sharing my screen anyway while I'm talking. So if you can just follow along then. I'm giving you the slides so that you can use them for asking questions later. Okay, so I'll just share my screen. Just a second. Sorry. Okay, share. Then, sorry. Okay, you should be able to see everything now, right? All right, excellent. So thank you again to Dawn, especially for being in touch and inviting me to give this talk. I'm really honored, and it's my pleasure to be talking about biased inquiries. So instead, I shared a paper earlier with you. I'm not going to cover everything that was in the paper, but I'm going to try to sort of frame the basic puzzle that the paper tries to bring out. And I'm going to sort of think, like, maybe towards the end, think about some possible solutions to the paper. So the paper is entitled "A Puzzle About Bias." So the aim of the paper, quite obviously, is to frame a puzzle about bias. So before we get into what the topic, like the details of the puzzle, so we need actually a distinction to make sense of the puzzle itself. So I'm going to introduce or distinguish two different kinds of bias. One is called weak bias, and the second is called strong bias. So what is a strongly biased investigation? So let an investigation just be any evidence gathering event or act. So it's basically like a kind of a process whereby you engage in the process, and as a result of it, you might get some evidence. So it could be something as simple as opening the door and looking outside, or opening your window and looking outside. That's what I mean by an investigation. Now, when is an investigation strongly biased? An investigation, I'll say, is strongly biased in favor of a proposition, just in case, before the investigation, that the agent is certain that her future confidence in that proposition will increase as a result of that investigation. So basically, the idea is something like it's an investigation such that before you're about to engage in it, you know, or you're absolutely sure that your confidence in a certain proposition is bound to increase. Now contrast this with weakly biased investigations. In a weakly biased investigation, what happens is that there is no guarantee that it will increase. However, you're sure that your confidence in the proposition won't decrease. That's the first thing. Secondly, you're somewhat confident that it will increase. So the difference is basically that in a strongly biased investigation, before the investigation, you know that the investigation is guaranteed to increase your confidence in the relevant proposition. While in a weakly biased investigation, you're certain that your confidence won't decrease, but you have some confidence that it might increase. We will soon see an example of this. Okay, so just to illustrate the distinction more clearly, I'm going to introduce some examples. So the examples are in service of a certain intuition. So the intuition, just to be sort of as clear as possible, it is that there are certain biased investigations, strongly and weakly biased investigations, such that an epistemically rational agent can't engage in those biased investigations. So that's the intuition I want to elicit from you. So let's start with an example. So here's the basic idea. There's popularity one. So I really want to believe that I'm popular. Now, right now, I am 0.5 confident. So I'm neither more confident that I'm popular than that I'm unpopular. So I'm 0.5 confident that I'm popular. But I know two things for sure. First, my friends are super polite. So if I ask them if I am popular, they will say yes. So they won't disappoint me. I also always take what my friends say at face value. So if my friends say I am popular, I'll be quite confident that I am. I'll raise my confidence, in this case, in my own popularity. So I gather all my friends around and ask them if I am popular. Predictably, they say yes. So I raise my confidence that I am popular. So this seems to me to be a paradigmatically irrational way of changing one's beliefs. So it's like a case where you keep nudging people to pay you a compliment. And when they pay you a compliment, you soon sort of raise your confidence in your own virtues or something. So I think this is irrational. And I think you should also agree that this is irrational. Okay, so this is the first case. The second case is slightly different. So in the second case, things are exactly like popularity one, except that I only sometimes take what my friends say at face value. So I don't always take what they say at face value, only sometimes take what they say at face value. So if my friends say that I'm popular, I won't lower my credence in my popularity, but I might become quite confident that I am popular. So I gather all my friends around and I ask them if I am popular. Predictably, they say yes. So I raise my confidence that I'm popular. So the difference between the two cases is that popularity one is a case of strong bias. It's a strongly biased investigation, because even before the investigation starts, I'm certain that, knowing all these facts about myself, that my confidence in my own popularity is going to increase. In the second case, I'm not certain that it will increase. I'm certain that it won't go down, but I have some confidence that it will increase. So popularity two, unlike popularity one, is not a strongly biased investigation. It is a weakly biased investigation. So that illustrates the distinction. Now, and in both cases, it seems that it's irrational for me to raise my credence in my own popularity. You might ask me why. So the simple explanation is this. It's like I all along knew what my friends will tell me if I ask them if I am popular. So plausibly, I can't get any new evidence when I talk to them. I already could anticipate what they were going to tell me. So if that's right, I can't rationally boost my confidence in my own popularity in response to what they say. So that's the intuition. The intuition is that in these sorts of biased investigations, it's irrational for me to raise my confidence. So it seems that an epistemically rational agent shouldn't be able to engage in these sorts of biased investigations. So what I'm going to do in the course of this presentation is that I'm going to say that, in fact, there are two anti-bias constraints that rule out undesirably biased investigations of this sort. However, these two constraints are incompatible with two other plausible theses. So what are these plausible theses? The first is evidence externalism, and the second is conditionalization. Okay. So let's start with evidence externalism. So evidence externalism is an extremely plausible thesis. It says that an agent's evidence can entail non-trivial propositions about the external world. So basically, the idea is that, well, our evidence is not simply restricted to what the inner goings on of our minds. It's actually can like include various claims, non-trivial claims about the external world. For example, the fact that this book is blue, that could be part of my evidence. That's the idea. What does conditionalization says? What does it say? It says that, well, an agent should update her credences or degrees of belief by conditionalization. So that basically means you don't have to worry about the technical details. That just means that once I get some amount of evidence, my future credence at the end of the process should equal my prior conditional credence in any proposition, given that evidence. We will talk about this idea in more detail later. For now, you don't have to worry about it. My claim is simply that if you accept the anti-bias constraints that I'm going to propose, you have to reject one of these two claims, either evidence externalism or conditionalization. So here's what is going to happen. I will do three things. First, I will formulate and motivate the anti-bias constraints. I will then show that how they conflict with evidence externalism and conditionalization. And I will then briefly explain how the problem can't be rejected by giving up the latter two theses. So the setup is, it's extremely sort of simple. The basic idea is that, well, there are these anti-bias constraints, they conflict with evidence externalism and conditionalization. Turns out that we can't solve the conflict, resolve the conflict by rejecting either evidence externalism or conditionalization. So we have to reject the anti-bias constraints, but that's problematic because they are extremely plausible. So that's the puzzle. Okay, so we are now in a position to sort of jump into the details of the puzzle. So I'll start by motivating the anti-bias constraints. So that's the first section. When is bias bad? Okay, so let's start. Before we actually can sort of figure out when bias is bad, we should try to figure out when bias is fine. That's the right way to proceed. So first answer is that, well, sometimes bias is totally fine when the proposition in question that we are, like our investigation is biased in favor of, that is self-locating. That is, it is about oneself or one's spatio-temporal location. So let me explain why that's the case. So think about a simple case like clock. So suppose I'm sure now that it's 11:59 a.m. Now I know the following thing for sure. In a minute, I'll look at a clock, then I'll be sure, given that the clock will show that it's 12 p.m., that the time is 12 p.m. Now, in this case, my investigation is surely biased in favor of the proposition that the time is 12 p.m. because I know that as a result of my evidence gathering act, my credence in that proposition is going to increase. But that seems fine because the proposition in question is about time, my own temporal location. The proposition in question is like, the time now is 12 p.m. Yeah, that's false now. That will be false, that will be true in a minute. So when it is true, I will get evidence that it is true. So it's fine at that point for me to raise my credence that the time now is 12 p.m. So in cases like this, where the proposition in question is self-locating about oneself or one's spatiotemporal location, bias seems completely fine. Now, this is actually can be generalized to other things about myself. For example, facts about myself, like whether I'm a certain kind of a person or where I am. So maybe 5 hours from now, I will know that I am walking through Regent's Park. And then, yeah, sure, in that case, my investigation is biased in favor of that proposition. But there's nothing wrong with that because that's about my spatial location. Okay. So that's the one observation, namely that bias is fine, can be fine at least, when the proposition in question is self-locating. Now, there's another sort of case where bias seems fine. So when there is loss of relevant information. So imagine a case like this. So suppose I had cereals for breakfast this morning. There's no doubt about it. But I want to believe a year from now that my breakfast was more exciting. I ask you, my trusted friend, to tell me a year from now that I had an omelette for breakfast today on this particular day. And I know I'll forget within a year what I had for breakfast this morning and what I told you. So I know for sure that in a year from now, I'll come to believe that I had an omelette for breakfast this morning, given that you will tell me, and I have no reason to distrust you. So this is actually an interesting case because, well, here, the proposition in question doesn't have to be self-locating. It could be something like, well, Nilanjan had cereals for breakfast on the 24th of October 2020. That could be the proposition. So it's not self-locating. It's not about my spatial location or about myself. It's it just carries objective impersonal information about the world. But in this case, the bias again seems fine. It seems totally fine for me to raise my credence that I had an omelette for breakfast today in response to your testimony, because I'm losing relevant information in that case. I'm going to forget that I had cereals for breakfast this morning, and I will forget that I told you to tell me what you in fact tell me. So given that I'm losing relevant information, the new evidence can indeed rationally boost my credence in favor of the proposition that I had an omelette for breakfast today. So bias, so again, this is a case of a biased inquiry, but the bias is fine in this case because there is loss of relevant information. So that's the second observation, namely that bias is okay when there is loss of relevant information. Now, there's a third and more tricky sort of case where bias also seems fine. And this actually comes up quite often in the discussions about fine-tuning arguments for the existence of God, because in those cases too, there seems to be some sort of biased inquiry going on. But we can sort of generally characterize what's going on in those cases. So, sorry. So when there is, there should be there is instead of there is no. That's a mistake. We'll come back to this. Don't worry about it. So the point is that when there is uncertainty about whether one will complete the investigation and therefore will end up in one of the outcomes of the investigation, then bias can in fact be found. So just to illustrate this, I'll give you an example. So I have hired 12 skilled marksmen. So they will flip a coin, fair coin in secret, and then shoot in my general direction. So if the coin lands heads, they're going to fire at me. So it's almost certain, given how skillful they are, that I will die. If the coin lands tails, they're going to intentionally miss me. Now, I'm sure that after the shooting is over, if I am alive, I'll discover that I'm alive. And this will make me confident that the coin landed tails, because it will give me an overwhelming amount of evidence that they were intentionally trying to miss me, and therefore that the coin landed tails. So this is a case of a biased inquiry. So I'm sure that if I were to complete the inquiry, if I were to find myself in one of the outcomes of the inquiry, that would rationally boost my credence in favor of one outcome of the coin flip. So here too, again, so there is no, we can be sure that there is, first of all, the proposition in question is not self-locating. It's not about me or my spatio-temporal location. It's about the coin flip. There is also, we can just stipulate that there is no loss of relevant information. The only factor that matters here is that, in fact, I'm unsure about whether I will complete the investigation. So bias is fine here because there is, not there is no, because there is uncertainty about whether I will complete the investigation. So I'm extremely uncertain about whether I might just die. So I'm not sure whether I'll complete the investigation. So when I discover that I'm alive, that gives me evidence about the outcome of the coin flip. All right. So we have seen three kinds of conditions under which bias seems fine. First of all, when the proposition is self-locating. Second, when there is loss of relevant information. And third, when the agent is unsure whether they're going to complete the investigation. Okay. So let an inquiry be an investigation that is non-lossy, that is, it doesn't involve any loss of information, and sure. So the agent's evidence before the investigation entails that she will complete the investigation. She will end up in one of the outcomes of the investigation. Now, the basic idea is that, the basic idea is that it's impossible for an epistemically rational agent to engage in weakly biased inquiries that are weakly biased in favor of non-self-locating information propositions. And the weak bias thesis says that it is impossible for an epistemically rational agent to engage in strongly biased inquiries that are biased in favor of, strongly biased in favor of non-self-locating propositions. So why call the strong bias thesis the strong bias thesis? It's because it's like more powerful, because like the strong bias thesis predicts not only that weakly biased inquiries are bad, it also predicts that strongly biased inquiries are bad, because any strongly biased inquiry is by definition a weakly biased inquiry. But the weakly biased inquiry, weak bias thesis, that only rules out strongly biased inquiries as irrational. It doesn't say anything about weakly biased inquiries. So there's a difference in strength between the two theses. Okay, So why should we accept these two theses? It turns out that if an agent were to violate the weak bias thesis, then she would accept certain bets that would together will sort of subject her to sure loss of utility by her own lights. So basically, the idea is that she would be exploitable. So basically, she could sort of foresee that she will be offered a combination of bets. And as a result of accepting them, she will be losing money, for instance. Another weird, interesting feature of the weak anti-bias thesis is that if the agent were to violate the weak anti-bias thesis, then it would be instrumentally irrational for her to gather cost-free information. So if evidence is made available to her for gathering and use at a negligible cost, she would turn down that opportunity of gathering that information and making use of it. So that's, both of these seem to be severe costs of rejecting the weak anti-bias thesis. If we were to reject the anti-bias thesis, we would have to say that foreseeable exploitability, as in the first case, that's totally fine. And if we were to reject that weak anti-bias thesis, we would have to say that it's fine sometimes. It's fine for, like, it's, in fact, sometimes people are required by instrumental rationality to turn down cost-free information. That seems like a bad consequence. Interestingly, similar bad consequences also hold for rejecting the strong anti-bias thesis. So if, sorry, this should be strong, actually, bad, another typo. So if an agent were to violate the strong anti-bias thesis, then she would rationally accept bets that together will subject her to a risk of utility loss, but no utility gain. So note that's the difference between the earlier problem and the second one. It's that if you were to violate the weak anti-bias thesis, then you could accept bets that together will subject you to sure loss of utility. If you were to violate the strong one, that you won't surely lose utility, but it would expose you to a risk of utility loss, but no utility gain. And similarly, if you were to violate the strong anti-bias thesis, then it would be instrumentally irrational for you to gather cost-free information under certain circumstances, not always. So I think the important moral here is that the weak anti-bias thesis is actually in some ways like worse, like violating that is worse than violating the strong anti-bias thesis. Okay. So that's the important, that's an important reason for accepting this anti-bias thesis over and above our case judgments. So the upshot that I want to emphasize is that the anti-bias theses themselves are quite plausible. Okay. So we have now formulated two plausible anti-bias constraints. Let's see where we can go from here. In the next section, what I want to show is that there's a conflict between these anti-bias theses and evidence externalism and conditionalization. Now, for the evidence externalist, so the evidence externalism roughly is like a combination of two claims. So as I'm understanding it, it is first of all the claim that our evidence is a proposition or a set of propositions, and it entails non-trivial propositions about the external world. Okay. Just to get a sense of what the view is, we can sort of work with some examples. So typically, evidence externalists think that when we see that, when I'm seeing that this book is blue, my evidence will entail that the proposition that the book is blue, for instance. So Williamson, for example, thinks that the propositions we know, they exhaust our evidence. That's a kind of evidence externalism because we often know non-trivial things about the external world. Goldman thinks something slightly different. He thinks that the propositions that we are non-inferentially uh, justified in believing in, those exhaust our evidence. There too, you might think, well, we non-inferentially are justified in believing various propositions about the external world. So that's a case where our evidence does entail non-trivial propositions about the external world. So not what I'm going to assume, like, just is this very minimal thing, namely that if you're an evidence externalist, you should think that at least when we see something as being the case, that proposition is part or is entailed by our evidence. That's all I'm going to assume. Now, an interesting feature of evidence externalism is that evidence externalists have to reject one of the following two constraints on evidence. So they have to say that certain structural principles about evidence, they cannot be true together. So these are the two crucial ones. So the first one is that an agent's evidence always entails truths. This is sometimes called factivity. So this says, well, your evidence cannot entail any false information. The second constraint is negative introspection, which says something like, if an agent's evidence doesn't entail a proposition P, then it entails that it doesn't entail it. So what does it mean? So it's something like this. So suppose your evidence doesn't tell you that P, then negative introspection will say that, yes, if it doesn't tell you something, then it will tell you that it doesn't tell you that thing. So basically, your evidence has a certain kind of access to itself. That's what negative introspection says. Now, so it's quite easy to actually see that there's a tension between these two things. So suppose you like Williamson's view about evidence. So you think, well, what we know, that's our evidence. Now, that will straightforwardly validate factivity because, well, you can only know truths. Knowledge is factive. So if you know that P, then P is true. So factivity will come out true on that picture. But negative introspection will definitely be false. Why? Well, because, like, suppose you don't know something, but you falsely believe it. So suppose I falsely believe that outside that door, there's a person standing. Now, if I falsely justifiably believe it, I might take myself to know it, right? Falsely. In that case, I will take my own evidence to entail that proposition, that there's someone standing outside that door. In such a scenario, even though my evidence doesn't entail that there's someone standing outside that door, it won't entail that it doesn't entail it. So negative introspection will come out false. So just to get a clearer sense of how the tension goes, I'll give you another example in a more sort of slightly abstract. Suppose you're looking at a wall. The wall looks red to you, but unbeknownst to you, it is in fact white and lit up with red light. So here your vision misleads you. It provides you false information that the wall is red without giving you any clue that it does so. So you can't rule out the possibility that you see that the wall is red. Okay, so in this case, two important features. So one thing is that the vision gives you false information in this case. Second is that you can't rule out the possibility that you see that the wall is red. Those are the two important bits of information to remember. Now, suppose factivity is true. Your evidence always entails truths. Then your evidence can't entail that the wall is red because that information is false. It can't entail false propositions. Now, suppose seeing that P is sufficient for your evidence to entail that P. So seeing that the wall is red, entails that the wall is red, makes your evidence entail that the wall is red. Now, since when you can't rule out the possibility that you see that P, your evidence doesn't rule out the possibility that your evidence entails that P. So basically, in this case, if you can't rule out the possibility that you see that the wall is red, then your evidence doesn't rule out the possibility that your evidence entails that the wall is red. So even though your evidence doesn't entail that the wall is red, your evidence doesn't entail that it doesn't entail that the wall is red. So negative introspection comes out false in this case. So basic lesson here is that given some background assumptions, evidence externalism entails that factivity and negative introspection can't be true together. Okay, so what follows from this? I'm going to argue that it follows that if we accept evidence externalism and conditionalization, we can't keep the anti-bias thesis that we just sketched. Why is that? Suppose, take this case, red wall. I'm about to enter a room, which is exactly like the red wall case that I just described, but slightly different. So suppose I'm about to enter a room and look at a wall. I'm now rationally 0.99 confident that the wall is red and the lighting conditions are normal, but assign a credence of 0.01 to the possibility that it might be white, but lit up with red light. So there's a small chance there will be deception. Suppose I'm rationally sure that if the wall is red and the lighting conditions are normal, then I will see that it is red. So my evidence will entail that the wall is red. So basically, this is just evidence externalism. Moreover, I'm rationally certain that if the wall is white but lit up with red light, it will appear red to me. So I won't be able to tell that in fact the wall is white, so it will remain compatible with my evidence that I'm seeing that the wall is red. That's the feature of the case. So the way to sort of think about the case is that you think of it as an inquiry where there are two possibilities before the inquiry that are open to me. The first possibility is possibility R, where the wall is red. And the second possibility is the possibility W, where the wall is white but lit up with red light. So R standing for red, W standing for white. Now, since the second possibility is just like the case I described earlier, evidence externalism entails that either factivity or negative introspection must fail here. That's what follows. Now, consider the possibility where factivity fails. So suppose factivity fails. So even in what that would mean is this, in W, even though I gain false information from vision that the wall is red, my evidence entails that the wall is red. So like my evidence entails false propositions because factivity is false here. So we can represent this using like standard sort of a picture for depicting epistemic models. You depict it with two worlds, R and W, where the arrows represent your evidence. So in R, you see that R, the arrow sort of circles back at R itself. That just means at R, the evidence sort of rules out W and only R is compatible with the evidence at R. In W, again, the arrow points only to R, which means that only R is compatible with the agent's evidence. So in both worlds, the idea is that in both worlds, R and W, the agent's evidence tells her that, in fact, R is the real world. It's like the actual world. So the agent's evidence entails that the wall is red. So that is why factivity fails. Now the interesting case is to sort of wonder what happens if in this case, we apply conditionalization. What happens if I update my credences by conditionalization in this case? So conditionalization says the following thing. It's like you don't have to worry about it if you are not already into probability theory, but I'll just sort of briefly say what the basic idea is. So the idea is that suppose the strongest evidence that an agent receives between two times is E, and her prior credence function, like her credence function at T, basically is C. Now, then her posterior credence function in credence in any proposition at T prime, that is the second time, that should be her prior conditional probability in P given E. So I'm assuming that the agent assigns non-zero probability to E. Otherwise, the ratio formula does not work. So that's what conditionalization says. Conditionalization says, well, you should just update your credences by adopting your conditional credences as your new credences in response to any evidence. That's what it says. That's quite like relatively simple. So one important consequence of conditionalization that we need is this. So when the proposition P is E itself, then the conditional credence in E given E will be 1. So basically, when you conditionalize on any bit of information, your credence in that information goes up to 1. So you become certain in that information. So that's the crucial bit of feature of conditionalization that we need here. Okay. Now, let's see how we can apply this to the case of to the factivity failure case that we just saw. So in this case, consider the proposition red, which just includes it's a singleton set containing the world where the wall is red. That's how we are going to think of the proposition. So my prior credence in red is basically 0.99. In both R and W, I gain red as evidence. So if I update by conditionalization on it, my posterior credence in red should be 1, right? That's what conditionalization says. It says that if you sort of conditionalize on E, your credence in E should go up to 1. So it should become 1, right? So if that is the case, in both worlds, my credence is bound to increase. It should be higher than my prior credence. If that is the case, this will be a strongly biased inquiry. That's the result. Now you might wonder, well, we can avoid this perhaps by just rejecting negative introspection in this case, but things are not so simple. Suppose factivity remains true, but negative introspection fails. Now in W, since I gain false information from vision that the wall is red, my evidence won't entail that the wall is red. But in W, I won't be able to rule out the possibility that I see that the wall is red. So R will remain incompatible with my evidence. So my evidence won't entail that it doesn't entail that the wall is red. So that will be the negative introspection failure. So once again, we can depict this world, this situation, using the sort of earlier sort of picture, similar picture here. So here we have two worlds, R and W. Again, R sees itself as before, just itself. However, W sees both itself and R. That is why, in this case, the agent's evidence in W doesn't entail that the wall is red. It leaves open that the possibility that the wall might be white. But so it sees, W basically sees both R and itself. That's the idea. Now, what happens in this case? So the important thing to note is that in R, the agent again gains the information that the wall is red. In W, she in fact gains no new information about the wall's color because both R and W remain open to her as it was before the investigation. So again, consider the proposition R. So the agent's prior credence in R is 0.99. In R, she gains red as evidence, but she doesn't gain any new evidence in W. In R, again, if she updates by conditionalization on red, her posterior credence in red should be 1. In W, her posterior credence in red should remain fixed at 0.99. That's because she's not gaining any new evidence in this case. So this is a weakly biased inquiry because the agent's credence definitely doesn't increase, but it could increase. There is one possibility, namely R, where it does increase. So what does it show? If evidence externalism and conditionalization are true, then the anti-bias thesis, both the anti-bias thesis, can't be maintained. So that brings us to the end of this section. Now we can say what the puzzle is. What I want to point out to actually get a sense of why this is puzzling, the problem is that the puzzle cannot be easily resolved by rejecting either evidence externalism or conditionalization. Why is that true? Note, so there are two problems with the sort of strategy of rejecting evidence externalism. First of all, it turns out, suppose you reject evidence externalism, what will you say? One sort of move that you could be making is to say that, in fact, our evidence never entails propositions about the external world. It only entails claims about our inner states, like our phenomenal states, what it is like for us to undergo this or that experience. So suppose that's the view you have. That's sort of a view which is very sort of Cartesian in its sort of the way it's kind of a Cartesian view about evidence. One way of fleshing that out would be to say something like this. So the point would be that a proposition is sort of part of your evidence, just in case it is something that you know introspectively by introspection, or something that you're in a position to know by introspection. But the interesting thing is that the same problems that we sort of saw for evidence externalism can be sort of replicated for Cartesian views. So just to understand why that's the case, the problem is for evidence externalism was that our sources of information about the external world are fallible. So sometimes they give us false information without letting on or giving us a clue that this has happened. Now, this is also true about the sources of information that we have about our phenomenal states. Why? Suppose think about the phenomenal state of feeling cold or hot. So suppose I'm expecting to be burnt by scorching hot water coming out of a tap. So when I put my hand under the water and quickly take it back, in that split second, like given that split second of experience, I might think that in fact the water was hot, but in fact, let's say it was just ice cold. So I could distinguish the two sensations. So in such a scenario, like the introspection is fallible because it can give us false information without letting on that it has done so. And as long as there is this possibility of getting false information in this particular way, we can get a situation where either factivity or negative introspection has to fail. And as long as that happens, we can sort of run the same argument that we did just now for evidence externalism. So the point just is that rejecting evidence externalism without rejecting conditionalization is not going to help us. Now, what about like maybe, so one response that you could have to this is that, well, perhaps a Cartesian person could sort of explain away cases of this sort that I just described. And they can say that, in fact, our introspection when it comes to the internal states, it's infallible. It can never give false information. But one problem with that view is that it ultimately leads to skepticism. So the problem is that if you keep conditionalization and you hold on to a Cartesian theory of evidence, your evidence is really impoverished. It contains no information about the external world. So it only includes information about what it feels like, or like what your internal states are like. Now, if you are updating by conditionalization, the only way you could ever sort of have strong confidence in any external world proposition is if you already have some sort of strong initial credence in skeptical hypotheses being false. So the point is that you would have to be initially be extremely confident that skeptical hypotheses about the world, they're just false. But that seems like a strange view to have because, well, unless you think that we have sort of strong, good a priori reasons to sort of discount skeptical hypotheses, that sort of constraint on our priors cannot be justified. So again, the problem is that the combination of the Cartesian view with conditionalization leads to skepticism about the external world. It makes it hard to explain how we could be rationally confident about various propositions about the external world. So this is a place where traditional epistemology starts mattering because the traditional skeptical argument comes back at this point. So what's the other strategy? The other strategy is just to reject conditionalization. And recently, several writers have explored this strategy. But here too, I want to highlight two kinds of costs that matter. So just to see what the costs are, let's go back a bit to the case where factivity fails in this case, like the case where in both in R and in W, you gain the information that the wall is red. So how could you avoid bias in this case? Note that in both worlds, your credences, your evidence is the same. In both worlds, you're learning that the wall is red. So whatever your rational policy of belief revision is, it should say, like, output the same credences in both worlds. Your credences should be the same in both worlds. So if that is the case, the only way for you to avoid bias in this case is if your credence never changed at all in these cases. So you could only avoid bias if even after you got the information that the wall was red, you did not raise your credence at all. You kept your credence fixed at 0.99 as before. But that seems counterintuitive. That seems counterintuitive because your evidence in this case entails that the wall is red. You have no uncertainty about what your evidence entails. You have no uncertainty about your ability to assess what your evidence says. So why should you not be certain in what your evidence says, given that you know clearly, perfectly what your evidence is? So it seems just counterintuitive to say in this case that you should not assign a credence of 1 to the proposition that the wall is red. But note that if you again assign credence 1, you will be engaging in a biased inquiry. So the cost essentially is this, that you will have to violate at least this first principle in this case, that if an agent's evidence entails P, then she should assign credence 1 to it. Now, suppose you want to keep this principle. Suppose you want to say that if an agent's evidence entails P, she should assign credence 1 to it. So the only way you can avoid bias with respect to red wall type cases is by saying that in that case, perhaps negative introspection fails. Now, the weird thing is this, like look at this case. Now, suppose take the case of the negative introspection. So in R, your evidence entails that the wall is red. So given the first principle, which says that if your evidence entails that P, then you should be certain in it. In R, your credence that the wall is red should increase to 1, right? Because your evidence entails that the wall is red. So it should increase to 1. Now, how can you avoid bias in this case, of either kind in this case? If your credence in W did not remain fixed at 0.99 or did not increase, but rather decreased. So in one world, it is bound to increase. So the only way of avoiding bias in that case if your credence did not increase or remain fixed at 0.99, but it decreased, went down from 0.9. But that's pretty crazy, right? That shouldn't happen because you are gaining no new evidence in W by the setup. So if you are not gaining any new evidence, your credences should not change willy-nilly. So the point here is that, again, the only way of avoiding bias in this case is if you allowed people's credences or degrees of belief to change without any change in their evidence. So like the lesson here is that, again, if we try to bias, we'll have to reject this second principle, which says that an agent shouldn't change rational credences unless she gains new evidence. That hasn't happened in this case. So the point is that, well, we can't reject conditionalization without violating plausible principles like this. So there are some costs here. So if you think that these are serious costs, the only option that is left to you is to sort of accept that the anti-bias thesis that I sketched are false. But that too seems bad because it's hard to shake off the intuition that engaging in biased inquiries is irrational. So that's the puzzle about bias. I'll stop here and maybe we can talk about some questions.
Thanks a lot, Nilanjan, for that very rich presentation. I think there's a number of issues worth discussing, and I'm sure people have questions and comments. And so I'll open up the floor to discussion very shortly. But before I do that, let me just mention that if you would like to ask a question, please use the raise hand function in Zoom in order to ask a question. The way to do that is to go to the participants window, and at the bottom of the participants window, you'll find a button for raise hand. Please use that. I will come to you in the order in which I see hands being raised. And the other request I would make is that if you have more than one question, please ask one question at a time. If you want to ask another question, just raise your hand again. I'll cycle back to you after I'm done with the first round of questions. With that said, please raise your hands if you have a question that you would like to ask Nilanjan. Okay, while people ponder the talk and think of questions, maybe let me begin by asking a question of my own.
Yes.
So this is regarding the so the reason you gave for not rejecting conditionalization.
Yes.
And that was that you have to reject this kind of intuitive principle that if your evidence entails something, then your credence in that should be one, right? Now, in a sense, I think that if you reject factivity, then you should reject that principle. That the whole point of rejecting factivity is that you're, in some sense, admitting that your evidence could be false. And so it seems strange to say that I admit my evidence could be false, and yet I'm committed to assigning my evidence one and all its entailments probability one. That seems like an irrational stance to hold. So it seems like if you reject factivity, you kind of have to, in some sense, reject conditionalization and go for Jeffrey conditionalization or something like that.
Okay, very good, great question. So that's a really interesting idea. So we can try to think about what these non-factive views about evidence are. So I think there are two things in the question that you asked, which need to be sort of separated. So there are two moves you could be making. One is the sort of Jeffrey conditionalization-like move, which could, in fact, need not involve anything like rejection of factivity, but rather it could be just something like, well, we are not going to accept even the view that our evidence forms is a set of propositions. We're just going to say it's a bunch of probability constraints that are imposed on your future credences, and Jeffrey, you just do the Jeffrey update on those new constraints. So suppose that's the view that you go. There is nothing in the Jeffrey view that actually prevents biased inquiry. That's the first thing. In fact, here's an interesting thing that you can prove is that Jeffrey has an idea that, and this is like actually becomes useful when you try to give Dutch book arguments for Jeffrey conditionalization, for instance. It's that he thinks like in order to get Dutch book arguments going for Jeffrey conditionalization, you have to think that in the course of the inquiry, when different probability constraints are being imposed on your relative to different stimulus conditions, let's say, those probability constraints have to be sort of mutually exclusive. So basically, there has to be higher order certainty at each point about your probability constraint. So you will need to get something like a version of factivity out of it. So something like this will happen. So two things will happen. So one thing so the idea is that the Jeffrey, in order to get, for example, Dutch book, prevent Dutch books for occurring for Jeffrey conditionalization, it has to be the case that whenever your posterior constraints are C, your evidence will entail that the posterior conditions are C, constraints are C. And if the posterior constraints are C, your posterior constraints, your evidence will entail that the posterior constraints are C and vice versa. Basically, it's like the posterior constraints have to be luminous in a certain sense. Like you'll have to always be in a position to be certain what your posterior constraints are. So that gives you both a version of negative introspection and factivity for the posterior constraints. So when that is violent, again, the same problem, bias problem will arise again for Jeffrey conditionalization. So that's basically one sort of a problem. So now the second problem is that suppose somehow you avoid that problem with the red wall case. How do we proceed from there? The interesting thing that will happen is that you'll have to tell me a story about what happens in the red wall scenario. So one point that you might say is that, in fact, in the red wall scenario, your credences should not change at all, right? You could say that. So it's like, it just remains fixed at 0.99. It's like you're just unmovable because you're suspecting that there might be this error occurring. The weird thing is that move, this is something that I did not say, but I think there's a nice opportunity to say it, is that that move suffers from the skepticism worry again. Because like, think about like a Bayesian super baby. It's like equipped with that update rule that you just mentioned, or it's like some sort of Jeffrey super baby, maybe not Bayesian super baby. Some sort of Jeffrey super baby was like equipped with that update rule. So whenever there's a possibility of error, like possibility of deception, like the way it happens in red wall, they just don't change their credences so that they avoid bias. The problem is that then what will happen is that when they're sort of starting out in their cognitive life and they are only equipped with imperfect sources of information, there will always be this possibility of error, right? So they will never sort of change their credences at all in response to new information. So again, the old skeptical worry comes back that they will never be able to rationally update their credences in favor of new information. So essentially, the tension that I'm depicting is really between a kind of skepticism and bias. So the idea is that the only way you can avoid skeptical worries is by sort of embracing bias of a certain kind. Does that answer your question?
So I'm not fully sure I understood the second part. So I accept that if this, so in circumstances like the red wall case, which has a particular kind of circumstance where you know before you enter the situation that what your evidence will not be able to distinguish these two things in a certain sense, right?
Yes.
That you'll have exactly the same, I don't know, phenomenal experience or whatever, however you want to think about it. In those cases, I can accept that your super baby is not going to learn anything.
Yeah.
But that doesn't seem a problem. I don't know why is that generalizable? that in cases
Okay,
that aren't like that, yeah.
Okay, good. That's a great follow-up. So, so think about this. Suppose it's like suppose the cases are subjectively distinguishable. So it's like something like, suppose the Bayesian super baby is expecting the following things to happen. So either there will be like a red wall and a deception scenario corresponding to it, or a white wall with a deception scenario corresponding to it, or a green wall with a deception scenario corresponding to it. Let's say that's what, like all these pairs of scenarios are subjectively distinguishable from each other, right? The interesting thing is that, like, if the Bayesian super baby, it's like becomes sort of like what will happen is that, yes, the Bayesian super baby will be perhaps be able to rule out some of the propositions here, right? So like when they are faced with the red wall, they will learn that it appears red to them. They won't learn anything more. Similarly, when they face the white wall, they will learn that it appears white to them, but not anything more. So again, in this sort of a scenario, they're restricted only to facts about how things appear to them, not to anything about the external world. You see, the idea is that if like you stop yourself from raising your credence in an external world proposition, whenever there's a possibility of deception, you make a choice of restricting yourselves to facts about appearances or how things are internally about you, rather than how things are in the external world.
Well, yeah, but so let's again assume that this baby assigns sort of 1/100th of the credence to each deceptive hypothesis,
Yes.
hypothesis as it does to the corresponding non-deceptive one. So it goes and now it sees what looks like a green thing to it. It will increase its credence in both the non-deceptive green hypothesis and the deceptive green hypothesis. It'll rule out the deceptive and non-deceptive red and white hypotheses.
That's right.
And so it has, in some sense, gained information about the world in that it's increased its credence in a particular proposition about the world, that this ball is green.
But okay, so you're saying the Bayesian person, the person has avoid biased, right? That's what you're saying, right?
Sorry.
So what I'm just pointing out here is that in either case, so the way you're suggesting we can avoid bias in this case is by sort of coming up with a case where the person is sort of not increasing any sort of so two things to say about this. So what I'm sort of saying is that the agent is raising their credence in some proposition about the external world, but they're not sort of categorically ever learning that proposition. That's one thing. But the second point is also that if you accept my point about like internalism, that the view that you can replicate skeptical worries even for internalism, one sort of thing that you could say there is that when the worry when the sort of the person learns learns all these possibilities. So if like there's a possibility of error for any source of information that you have, there can be even a negative introspection failure when it comes to color appearances, right? So we can make mistakes about color appearances. So even that, there will be a kind of a negative introspection failure or a factivity failure corresponding to color appearances. So if there's a factivity failure in response to color appearances, you're also not going to raise your credence according to the rule that we just described. So so the idea is that you will never get to a point where you can raise your credences, because like the Bayesian super baby has the whole space open to them. Everything is included in the space.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
So yeah, I sort of see the response. I have some other
reservations.
I'll save them for now because there's other people with their hands up, so I'll move on. But thanks for the response. Yeah, Darshi, you have a question you'd like to ask? Oh, sorry. Darshi has requested that I ask Prashanta before him. So Prashanta, would you like to come in? Prashanta, are you there?
Yes, I'm there.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yes, yes.
Thank you, Professor Dash. Good hearing you. So I have two comments, one in response to Torun's question, and one is about the conditionalization.
Yes.
Sorry, Prashant, I accidentally muted you again. Could you unmute? I was trying to lower your hand and I muted you. Yeah. Sorry about that. Yeah.
Can you hear me, Nilanjan?
Yes, I can.
So the first thing is that the two options you have, the using externalism going against that and conditionalization going against that. But the one of the objections, now you might say, well, I cannot use that objection against conditionalization. One of the objections is that when you use conditionalization, you can only use conditionalization is when the one on which you're conditionalizing is the data are a priorly known. For example, you can conditionalize it on probability of drawing a spade given the card drawn I have in hand, it is a spade. So that means where the priority distributions are well known, otherwise you cannot do it.
Good.
So,
yeah.
So if, it's a Kaiberg's objection actually. So against conditionalization. So that's one. And your use of the about the justification of the Dutch book argument, there are also objections that basically the Dutch book argument has nothing to do with probabilities, completely deductive loss. That means if you do not want any sheer loss, do not use deductive. Do not use Dutch book argument. So I will let you speak. Am I clear what I said? So the first question is that why not you just question as a whole the conditionalization principle that you cannot apply? And the second one is that Dutch book argument has really nothing to do with probabilities, completely has to do with deductive logic. That means if you do not want a sheer loss, do not accept those weights. Okay.
Good. Okay, two things. So one thing is that, yes, so there is a level of idealization going on where I'm assuming that there are agents have well-defined probabilities in these sorts of cases. But note that the worries don't really sort of depend on any of those, that assumption. What we can do is like, so first of all, like the basic conflict can be framed independently of people actually having well-defined probabilities. So the worry very simply is something like this. Suppose like, even if you don't have like very well-defined probabilities, you can at least be sort of more or less confident in things. And as long as that's the case and you like sort of updating something like according to the principle that, well, first, you never change your credences unless there's a change in your evidence. And second, whenever you have evidence and you have perfect access to your evidence, you will just become certain in the evidence. If you accept just those two principles, you will get the problem that I am sort of gesturing at. So those are basically the principles that I mentioned at there. So the idea is that the conflict, even if you rejected conditionalization and kept those two principles, you would be fine. So ultimately, again, I'm just saying that in the abstract, the problem, the conflict is between those kinds of principles and a certain way of updating your beliefs and externalism, basically. So that's the first thing. The second thing to say about Dutch books, I do rely to some extent on the Dutch book arguments. So one thing is that I actually, the way I understand the matter, is that the Dutch book arguments are a sort of an illustration of a general idea, namely that that a certain kind of exploitability, if you are foreseeably exploitable, then that indicates that there is something going wrong in the way you're planning to update your beliefs. So now exploitability in some cases has to do, like the standard Dutch book arguments, it has to do with pragmatic value of some kind, like utility, but it need not necessarily, because the same sorts of arguments are also available when you're dealing solely with epistemic value, like raising your credence, like where you're like something like accuracy, for instance. So even if you don't buy the specific Dutch book arguments, like the accuracy-based arguments themselves will be sort of probative in these sorts of cases. And so this is something general to be said, namely that the kinds of cases we are talking about are cases where uh, factivity or negative introspection fails. It turns out that Dutch book arguments and accuracy-based arguments, in fact, tell you not to update by conditionalization. That is actually a general fact. So Miriam Schoenfeld has a paper where in Mind, where she shows the thing about the accuracy-based arguments. I have a forthcoming paper in PPR where I show the thing about the Dutch book arguments. What I want to point out is that, like, even though those arguments might in other cases look plausible, I think, like, given the plausibility of these sorts of intuitive principles, like the idea that when you have perfect access to your evidence and your evidence entails that P, you should be certain in P, or that you should never change your mind unless there's a change in your evidence, the plausibility of those sorts of principles should lead you to sort of question the plausibility of Dutch book arguments or accuracy-based arguments. In fact, what Dutch book arguments and accuracy-based arguments will tell you to do in these sorts of cases is it will give you like completely counterintuitive advice. They will tell you, in fact, what you should be doing is you should be updating on the fact that your evidence in such and such. But that's just impossible for you to do in a negative introspection failure case, because there you in fact have no access to what your evidence in fact is. So it asks you to do something impossible. Like, it's like asks you, those arguments tell you to do the impossible in the sense, like it tells you to form beliefs which have no connection in any obvious sense with your evidence. So that's a limitation of those arguments. So I don't think in those cases they are in fact probative. What I'm therefore inviting you to do, like in light of these sorts of weird counterintuitive features, I want you to hold on to conditionalization, given the plausibility of the principles that I think are correct. I want you to hold on to evidence externalism. And then I'm inviting you to question your initial judgment that anti-bias constraints were right after all. So that is something that you might think is like largely, it's like a counterintuitive conclusion to advocate, but that's what philosophy does. It sort of threatens like the common sense, the status quo when you're sort of starting out to do. Like that might seem very plausible when you start out to do philosophy. So that's my position. My position is that we should accept biased inquiries in these cases, and not reject conditionalization or evidence externalism. Does that view make sense, Prashantada?
Well, I have to reflect. I'm not that fast. I have to think a little bit more. So I should let Priyadarshi talk. And
okay,
thank you, Nilanjan.
Yeah, you can come back and ask me later.
Yes,
yeah.
I will come back. Yeah. So I'll let Priyadarshi talk about. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Prashanta. Dashi, would you like to ask a question now?
Yes. Okay. Nilanjan, thanks for a very intricate talk. And
thank you.
I went against my own principle. I insisted in this book we have papers in advance, and I must say I hadn't read it. I looked at it today, and I realized it will take me about 2-3 days. But I presume the BJPS paper covers most of this, right? So I will.
Some of it, yes, definitely.
Yeah, some of it. Okay, so I will read that eventually and get back at you. And another error I made was my Vivek. I don't know if you know him. He's doing his PhD at Edinburgh. He was working with Pritchard, and now his advisor has changed. So he's working a lot on factivity. So he should have been here, but I didn't inform him. I just informed him. I don't know if he can come on. He can ask much more sensible questions than I can. So I have like maybe very general question. It doesn't relate to, I can't find any, from what I heard, I can't find any, though I have one suggestion at the end, which I think you've already taken care of. Maybe I begin with that. That is, rather than finding, incompatibility, you can go for a revision of both, right? Of externalism, evidence externalism and conditionality, as well as the anti-bias thesis. So maybe they can be reconciled by doing proper revisions of both. And I think you were suggesting something like that. Okay. So my very general question is this, that I apologize, I'm not kept up with this literature much, but Vivek has been talking about factivity. I find some problem with the way it is stated, but let me not get into that. So what I want to know is, how is the word entailment being used? Because when you say, knowing entails truth, and when you were saying evidence in the externalist thesis, right? Evidence externalism, evidence entails the proposition. You don't say that the proposition is true. I think you say entails the proposition. You felt shy of saying that the proposition is true. It entails the proposition is true. So when we're going, in the old traditional analysis of knowing, which is what I'm familiar with. So the entailment there means that it is a necessary condition, right? So truth is a necessary condition, but the entailment here seems to be meaning something else. So is the word entailment being used in two different senses? And then what exactly, surely not logical entailment, I don't think. So what is the sense of entailment? Because Tarun also, he said something about the evidence being true, but the question isn't about evidence being true, but the question is about evidence entailing the known proposition, right? So this is though in a strictly logical sense, there wouldn't be entailment if there wasn't truth. So that's what I want to know, especially for the evidence externalism, since you're using the word the entailment from evidence to the proposition. What does evidence mean there? And is it the same as when I say that knowing P entails P, or P is true?
Right. Okay. So a couple of things about entailment. So the way I'm thinking of it is like quite simply in terms of like the representation of propositions in the way you do probability theory standardly. Here's a way of thinking about it. So what you have is a space of events, right? So what you have is an event space where you have maximally specific events. Like one way of thinking about the maximally specific events are as possible worlds, like maximally specific ways for the world to be. Now, propositions on this picture are just sets of possible worlds, which are like a way for the world to be. Now, now I'm thinking of evidence as a set of propositions. This could be things that you know, things that you're justified in believing in, lots of different things. But if you think of it as a set of propositions, then we can talk about sets of possible propositions entailing each other, or sets of propositions entailing other propositions, in the sense that if you put all the members of the set together, you can check whether the intersection of those propositions is in fact a subset of another sort of set of possible worlds or not. So whenever they are like the subset of another set of another proposition, that is just what entailment is. So the entailment here is just a set theoretic notion. It's just subset relation. That's what it means.
That's fine.
Yeah. And like then ultimately what will happen is that when you're thinking about these things modeled theoretically, the principle that I'm calling factivity, that is basically something like if you try to represent all these things with a sort of in a kind of a modal framework, it will just become the T axiom in standard modal logic. So it just means EP implies P, something like that. And which is very close to what you have. Like when you say, if you know that P, then P is true or something like that. That's the T axiom for the logic of knowledge, basically. So basically, so entailment there, like, so there's a model theoretic notion of entailment and a syntactic notion of entailment. When I'm talking, I'm only thinking about the model theoretic one, where it's represented by a subset relation.
Okay, I think that clears things. And just one comment about factivity, though. I think you're rejecting it anyway. The problem I have with the term, again, going back to the classical analysis, is that the condition is that P is true, or sometimes it's stated as P, right? And to bring in factivity, it seems to me to be going to the next recursive step and asking for a definition of what P is true, asking for a definition of true. So when I give an analysis of knowing, I'm not required to hold on to any definition of what is true. So the whole idea of the word fact coming in, okay, I just get obsessed with this term. How does the word fact come in? Because it has some bias that the definition of P is true is going to be something like a correspondence theory or something like that. All I need to be committed to, and I don't even need to be committed to that, is the semantic conception of truth, which does not commit me to any theory of truth. Okay.
Yeah.
So I am just committed to a semantic conception of truth. And now we're going to replace true by some sort of a probability, maybe Bayesian or otherwise, with the evidence, giving a certain probability, maybe a limit approaching to 1 or something like that, right? And so that can be built into the semantic conception of true because you put it on either side. Okay? So you put it on both sides. You put in snow is white, something. You put a subscript there to indicate what you mean by that, and then you say snow is white, and you put a subscript there again. So the semantic conception retained, and nothing about the fact of the word is fact is coming in.
Yeah, so I should just mention that when I say factivity, when other people talk about factivity, they don't really have anything like as strong as like discussion of facts in mind. What they have in mind. So factivity is actually a linguistic notion. So when you call a verb factive, that just means that, well, you can draw an inference. Like, for example, if I say, I learned that P, then from that you can make the inference P. Basically, you can infer P. That's what factivity means in just like standard way of thinking about these verbs. It's just like the idea is then sort of turned into this kind of a principle where when you say knowledge is factive, what you just mean is that the ascriptions of knowledge entail whatever is being sort of ascribed as the content of the knowledge. So that's what factivity means in this context.
Okay, much clearer now. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Rashi. Jyoti, you have a question?
Hello, thanks for the talk. My question is regarding the very foundations of this whole paper, which is related to inquiry. So in the pre-read, it has been clearly mentioned that intentionally biased inquiry is not possible. And instead, we attribute to excess principle, where we are going to entail even those evidences that are not part of, that does not support the proposition. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'll take an example of what Perfect says, that if I'm somebody who wants to believe in God, I'm going to read only those books that are written by believers of God and avoid books by atheists. So it seems at first instance that this is feasible thing to do. So a lot has been said that how this is irrational. This leads to a case where we have a sort of win-win principle, but not much has been said that how is this affecting the process, the scientific process of inquiry? Is there a normative worry? So
okay, yeah.
if
So you are
say
talking about
this, yeah.
you. Okay, thanks. That's a great question. So you are talking about Bernard Sallow's paper, which I suggested as a pre-read. So, okay, so I need to distinguish two things here. So when Salo says that biased inquiry or biased investigation is impossible, he means something slightly different from what I mean when I talk about biased investigation. And that understanding that difference is slightly important. So he means something like a case where you expect the evidential support for a certain proposition to increase as a result of your inquiry. That basically, so in that sense, the claim is that it is impossible to set an inquiry such that the agent expects her evidential support for a certain proposition to increase as a result of that inquiry. I am actually not understanding bias in exactly the same way. My claim about bias is more stated in terms of the agent's actual beliefs, not in terms of her evidence. So the claim is that, on my view, it's like a case where, like put it very simply, or in a way that is closer to Salo's, it is that it's a case where the agent expects her credences to sort of increase in favor of a certain proposition. That would be a case of a biased inquiry. Now, so when Salo says biased inquiry is impossible, he means that, well, evidence cannot change in that particular way. When I am not saying that biased inquiry is impossible, I am saying biased inquiry is irrational. So I agree that people often do change beliefs in that way. So pay me a compliment, I'll immediately believe you. That may be a feature of me as a person. That is possible. What I don't think is that when I do it, I'm irrational to do in at least some of these cases, like the popularity case. So yes, you are right that the way I'm thinking of it is more in terms of norms of epistemic rationality, where I'm saying that the norms of epistemic rationality, if the anti-bias theses are true, then the norms of epistemic rationality are such that they prevent me from engaging in biased inquiries. Does that help?
It does. This distinction actually helps to understand how both the paper, the pre-read and the main read, your paper is set up. It really helps. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, thanks a lot, Jyoti. Don has a question. Go ahead, Don.
Hi, Nilanjan. I had two questions. The second question, perhaps I'll come in the second round. But while I was listening to your response, I think to Tarun and perhaps also to Darshi, and in your paper, there was a footnote where you said when you motivated evidence externalism, you pointed to, I think you mentioned forget his name, the author of Mind and World.
McDowell?
McDowell, yes, yeah. Right. See, it's, when you say that, look, when you gave the example of the Bayesian super baby, the evidence which might be gathered, which would be only the case where you would get evidence only of seemings. So you would have evidence of seeming to see a red ball or seeming to be the white ball. And here, I think you can fill in for me when you give your response. If at all the worry is that, look, these are scenarios where which would lead you to skepticism. See, somebody like McDowell, and although even I'm not quite sure whether McDowell's position should be understood as evidence externalism, but Williamson, although he doesn't clearly hold that position, I know that Sosa does, where he says, look, if we are holding the position that, look, you take these two cases, the good case and the bad case, and think of them as having a common factor, and then go from there to say that, look, you have evidence, then you add on something to the evidence to arrive at what you know. And they reject that, saying that, look, you need not think of it as a common factor case.
Yeah.
So in that case, so if at all that is given as a response to the problem of, look, if at all the example with the super baby example case is that, you know, it would lead to skepticism. Would someone with this position that look, that's not the way we arrive at knowledge. You don't have to think of as a common state and then add on evidence to it and then arrive at knowledge. What would be your response to that? I just like to know what your comments are on
Good.
these.
Yes. So basically, one way of understanding the response is in terms of the response to a very sort of traditional skeptical argument that you see in both the history of Indian philosophy and also in the West. So basically, the argument is a kind of an argument from error. So the thought is that, well, for any case, take the case where I'm looking at my bottle in front of me. So like the point is that suppose you're undergoing this perceptual experience and on the basis of that believe that there's a bottle in front of you. We can create a subjectively or phenomenally indistinguishable situation where in fact there is no bottle in front of you, but you're undergoing an experience like it. So that's the idea. Then the claim is that because these are phenomenally indistinguishable, your evidence is the same in both cases. If your evidence is the same in both cases, like the claim is that if you don't know in one case, you shouldn't be able to know in the other case. So you don't know in the good case either, in the case where you're actually looking at the bottle. So that's the sort of skeptical argument. The place where people like evidence externalists get off the ground, get off the boat, is where from this premise which says that if the two scenarios are phenomenally indistinguishable, then your evidence is the same in the two cases. So they say that they would say that in fact phenomenal indistinguishability doesn't really sort of determine what your evidence is. There are other things that are actually responsible in determining what your evidence is. For example, how you're connected up with the external world. And they would say that given that in fact you are sort of safely acquiring information, safely or reliably acquiring information from the external world, you can count as having evidence, even in the good case, but you don't have it in the case where you're being misled by your perceptual system. So actually you don't have to go as far as McDowell, like his views are particularly idiosyncratic. I think like as a general anti-skeptical view, this is what evidence externalists have in common, namely that they would reject that premise of the skeptical argument. Now, what I'm saying is that suppose you take the move that like Tarun was making, which is, I think, an extremely interesting move, which is that you don't reject evidence externalism, but what you do is modify the updating rule that you have. So basically, when you expect false evidence, when you are thinking that you might get false information in any form, you are just not going to be sort of raising your credences in response to that evidence to accommodate that information. What I'm saying is that that move has the same problems as the view that does not accept evidence externalism, because as long as there's a threat of misleading evidence, if you never raise your credence, you will actually, the Jeffrey super baby will never in fact be raising their credences at all, because there is always a threat of, like, at least because the Jeffrey super baby in a sort of an initial cognitive state does not have any evidence. They can't rule out any of the possibilities. So they can't be raising their credences at all. So the idea is that as long as the skeptical possibility is open to the Jeffrey super baby, if they're following that Jeffrey update rule, they're never going to raise their credences at all because they will be worried. So that's the general structure of the response I was giving to the idea is that like the same skeptical problem can be replicated for the Jeffrey update. So that's basically was the idea originally. So one thing I should mention is that like McDowell's view has like certain kinds of consequences, which I'm not particularly comfortable with. Like, for example, I'm not comfortable with the kind of naive realism that he's committed to. I think, or the kind of I think rather we should be kinds of representationalists about our sort of perceptual experience, for instance. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Don. Tanuj, you have a question? You just lowered your hand. Okay, good. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I was not entirely familiar with the procedure whether I'm supposed to lower the hand after I show up.
No. I'll lower your hand. Don't worry about doing it. Yeah.
Thank you, Nilanjan, for the talk. I
Thanks.
have to apologize before I ask my question because it's like it was really early. I'm on California time, and it's like it was like 6 a.m. in the morning, so I couldn't entirely follow the argument. But I think over the course of few days, I will also go through the material that you've sent. My question is more clarificatory, and it has to do with what you take to be the relationship between the conditionalization principle, evidential externalism. And maybe in the course of your answer, you could clarify what you mean by the conditionalization principle. What I took to be the connection between the two was that if I stick to the conditionalization principle, in some sense, I already have to be a good evidential externalist.
Yes.
Okay, so
Okay, I see. All right.
do you take to be there to be like a strict relationship between the two, or is that not necessary?
No, actually, historically, many people who think that conditionalization is correct are not evidence externalists. For example, if you look at like early 20th century defenders of conditionalization, like people like C.S. Lewis and C.I. Lewis and people like that, they don't think that evidence externalism is true. In fact, like you might think that if you like conditionalization, you would reject evidence externalism because conditionalization asks you to be certain in various propositions, right? But they would think, well, you can never be certain in external world propositions. So you should not be conditionalizers. If so, if you're an evidence externalist. So if you like conditionalization, rather what you should be is something like a Cartesian person. So those people reason like this, but that of course is a flawed way of reasoning, because you might think certainty is more like, so for me at least, I can tell you my view. And this is actually connected to one of the possible solutions to the problem I'm describing. So for me, at least, like evidence is something which is context, like what counts as evidence depends on the context that we are in. So it's just like knowledge. Just as knowledge descriptions are context sensitive, evidence descriptions are also context sensitive. So what happens is that, yes, within a context which is non-skeptical, you can be sort of certain in lots of evidence externalist propositions. But when the skeptical possibilities become salient to you, you cannot. So it's a kind of a sort of a fluid notion, the evidence, like it keeps shifting its boundaries. So there's nothing with like being certain or conditionalization within like and becoming certain in like external world propositions when you are in a non-skeptical context. So I think that is where the flaw of that original argument lies. It's the same flaw that Descartes, like some Cartesians make when they say that, well, in fact, like the foundational things in your sort of structure of beliefs can only be propositions about your mind, because those are the things that you can be like really sure about. That seems false. Like it seems like anything, if anything I could build on, it's like the claim that there are a bunch of books and bottles in front of me. Yeah.
Right. Thank you for your response. So just to clarify, the more um, historically it has been the case that when people think of the conditionalization principle, if they are evidential externalists, they don't go for the principle. But you are saying that there is this tight connection between the two.
Okay, so I'm saying that if they are conditionalizers, if they like conditionalization, they typically often have originally rejected evidence externalism.
Okay.
There are people who are evidence externalists of a certain kind who accept the version of the view, like more recently. For example, Williamson thinks that your degrees of evidential support are basically like given by an or prior conditionalized on what you know. So that means the evidential probabilities are basically determined by what you know. Now, if you think that from there, it's a short step that your credences, at least in some cases, should match those evidential probabilities, then your credences should just match what you know. So they should match. Like if what you know entails some proposition P, then you should be certain that P. So that becomes a version of conditionalization in that case. I'm not saying, however, that Williamson believes in conditionalization. It's not clear what he believes, what update rule he believes in. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, Darshi?
Yeah, just one more general question, which I think you answered it in your last comment, and
Yes.
it was a very simple. So, is evidence externalism domain specific? So, I can't think of examples right now, so I'm shifting that to you. If it is, can you give some domains where it doesn't apply, or an example of a domain it may not? Since you mentioned C.I. Lewis, I'm not sure, but C.I. Lewis, may not be an evidential externalist as far as basic propositions go. And I know that basic and non-basic propositions, that distinction is probably not there anymore. And so if we make that distinction, yeah, surely regarding basic propositions, there wouldn't be a evidential externalists, but maybe the evidence externalists are so for basic propositions as well. So that may be where the conflict might be. But as far as non-basic propositions go, then maybe you may have a compatibility between it. But that point I can't argue right now. So I just want to push this domain specific. I mean, is it domain specific, and which are examples of domains where it may not work so well?
Yeah, so one kind of sort of so that's a good question. So Williamson thinks that all propositions, things that we know, those are part of our evidence. So like any external world proposition that we know, that can be part of our evidence. In contrast, like people like Goldman, they think that in fact, propositions that we are non-inferentially justified in believing, like perceptual propositions, things about introspection, our own states, those are part of our evidence. So you can have so these views that sort of can differ in terms of like domain restrictions. However, one worry you might have is like in the case where, for example, you come to know something on the basis of induction, for instance. So suppose you do like an inductive inference. There you are, like when you arrive at the conclusion of the inference, you might not be entirely sure that it is correct, but you might be quite confident that it is correct. In such a scenario, it might be strange to think that once you come to know it, it becomes part of your evidence, and now you should be certain of it. So you might think that in those kinds of cases where you're forming beliefs on the basis of inductive reasoning or some sort of like ampliative reasoning, there you might think evidence externalism doesn't hold, like even if you know the proposition. So it might well be the case that it is restricted to like propositions that you know in some sort of direct, non-inferential manner. So like only those kinds of external world propositions would be part of your evidence.
Okay, thanks, Tashi. So I had another question. This is probably kind of a naive question. So I'm not that familiar with epistemology. So when I think about evidence, I usually think of it from a kind of philosophy or science perspective. So this is just a question about how maybe epistemologists would think about evidence. So it seems like underlying a lot of your discussion of evidence is the assumption that if something is evidence for you, then you believe that. If a proposition is evidence for you, then you believe that proposition. In some sense, that if you don't believe something, then it's not evidence for you.
Yeah.
Right. And it seemed like your argument for why factivity and negative introspection are in tension kind of relied on this assumption that if you that an evidence has to be a kind of belief that you have. It can't be, you can't have evidence that you don't believe, in which case it seems like you could sort of make negative introspection and factivity kind of compatible on that account. The kind of intuitions that suggest the tension might evaporate there. So I'm wondering if that is an assumption that is kind of universally shared among epistemologists who work on this, or are there people? So it seems to me that, I mean, at least from a philosophy of science perspective, I would want to talk about evidence in a way that doesn't commit one to the subject subject believing in it, but the subject having some other kind of access to it. But it's possible to have a kind of failure where you have that access, but you still fail to acknowledge or believe the evidence in some sense, right? Even though it is still evidence for you, right?
That's an excellent question. It's a very good, yeah, really interesting question. So I actually am sympathetic to that thought. Okay, so let's start by sort of distinguishing two notions of evidence. So one is this kind of a thing evidence notion, where it's like, well, it's like fingerprints on like some murder scene. That's like the thing itself is the evidence. Then there is notion of evidence, which is more like information, which is the kind of notion that we are interested in. Then there is also this other kind of notion that some epistemologists talk about, where the mental states themselves are the evidence. So it's like certain experiences, those particular mental events are the evidence. So we are going to sort of, let's say, we are going to set that aside because that view is like, has weird consequences. So we are also going to set aside the thing notion of evidence, because ultimately, when you think about the thing notion of evidence, it seems like indirectly people are still talking about various pieces of information pertaining maybe to the fingerprints. Okay, so what we want to focus on is the notion of information, evidence as information. So I think information, that just means like some sort of a content of a mental state in this context, at least. Now, what kind of mental state? I don't think it has to be a belief particularly. It could well be something that an experience that you're undergoing, but you may not have formed any belief on the basis of it. But you are perhaps like, if you were to reflect on it or were to sort of direct your attention to it, you will be able to extract that information. So the reason why you want something like that to be the case, it's something like information that is in some sense accessible to you on the basis of the mental states that you're undergoing. The reason why we want that kind of accessibility is because evidence, at least in epistemology, is supposed to play a normative role of like we're justifying various sort of norms on belief. Like you might think, well, people say things like, well, a wise person or a rational person proportions their beliefs to their evidence. Well, if evidence were inaccessible to that person, it's not obvious what that norm would really mean. Like that evidence is not, like there are lots of bits of information available to others and not to me. No one thing expects me to proportion my beliefs to evidence that is available to you, for instance, if I have no obvious kind of access to that evidence. Okay, so the idea is that we want to get to something like that. So one sort of view that is like very externalisty, but still sort of manages to keep that, is something like evidence is information that you're positioned to know in something. So it's like, suppose you're undergoing an experience, you have not registered it properly, you have not formed a belief, but still you're in a position to know something on the basis of it. That would be a case where the evidence is, in a certain sense, accessible to you. But you might think in like science, for example, there will be a different kind of access that is still sort of available. So like often in scientific community, people talk about collective evidence that is available to maybe some parts of the community, but not to other. And so you might think like the scientific community as a whole should form beliefs or form theories that are well justified by lights of the totality of the evidence that is available to the entire community. So there, the relation of access, because you have multiple agents, it's slightly harder to sort of formalize, because it's like we are no longer talking about a single agent. So we are relying on some sort of network of information transmission through which that needs to happen. But the idea you might still like think is similar enough to the case of individual knowledge. You might think like as a collective entity, what is the community in a position to know? Like you can talk about collective knowledge. If you think there's something to that idea, you might have a sort of a analogous notion of evidence for that view too. So that's what I think. So my view is like evidence is some sort of subset of the information that you're in a position to know. That's the view that I think is seems right.
Okay.
Does that make sense, or do you have more
Yeah.
questions?
So I mean, just to clarify a little bit. So
Yeah.
so yeah, I think on that view, then it would make sense to say that one has certain evidence, but that it need not be. So when you talked about initially, I was, I guess, disagreeing when you seem to suggest that it's information in some mental state. But what you say now, it doesn't even have to be in a mental state. So in a position to know doesn't mean that you're actually mentally representing it in any way, right?
Yeah, so that's like, it's a tricky locution in a position to know.
Yeah.
So at least in a sense, I think the way, so I have a very sort of externalist view about thinking about information. So information carried by mental states doesn't mean that there has to be a sort of a sentence in your belief box or in your head that represents the information.
Okay.
It's often like the information that we have of our environment is kind of like certain kinds of information carrying states need not be, like, strictly speaking, representation involving states. So ultimately, like, my notion of information is quite broad. And my notion of mental states here could be something like, it could be like perceptually representing a world in a certain way. It could be implicit beliefs that I have, which I may not explicitly sort of have representations corresponding to. So it could be a range of different things. So the notion of information that I think is correct is relatively broad. So it did not restrict us to sort of things that we are sort of consciously representing, or things sent, or like somehow like representations or images stored in our brain. So yeah, that's the, does that help? What I do think is that it's quite important that it be a content of a mental state, because otherwise the notion of accessibility becomes extremely hard to sort of get a grip.
Well, so how would you account for, so maybe you just call this thing evidence, but so it seems like it makes sense to say for a particular scientist, let's say that a scientist had evidence available that they ignored, maybe not consciously but unconsciously, because they're subject to some kind of confirmation bias or something like that.
Very good.
Yeah.
Yes. So evidence available. That's the notion, right? So it's like so one way of interpreting those sorts of locution is that there's like an evidence out there which I did not get to, something like that. Now, so one way of understanding is that those are like non-literal uses of the word evidence, or like those are not strict uses of the word evidence. It's like, if he were to discover that information, or if he were to discover those facts, they would become evidence for him, which he could then use for other purposes. So available evidence could, so I can say available evidence in this sense, right? So suppose my partner left like a note on the fridge saying that we have run out of milk, and I'm sort of just about to start breakfast. So, but obviously I was planning to make something with milk. Now you might say, well, Nilanjan had available evidence that they had run out of milk, given that note on the fridge. Yeah, there's a sense in which it is available. It just means that if I were to look at the note, I would just come to immediately know that we had run out of milk, basically. So the way to understand that notion of availability is not what I have in mind when I say in a position to know. It's like a more sort of, that notion of availability is more something like accessibility of some truths in mind, which I could in principle discover in some way.
All right.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we are out of time. Darshi still has.
I just wanted to add one sentence that
Okay.
some of the evidence is not even going to be propositional. So the requirement of belief in evidence may not work. Okay. Because some of the evidence may not even be propositional, and belief is definitely a propositional evidence. Okay.
Do I get to respond to that or no?
Yes.
Sure. Yeah.
So I think it depends on what you mean by proposition again, right?
Yeah.
So this is connected to my representation.
Okay.
So if you think of propositions as some people do these days, as in terms of like extremely sort of like very closely tied to explicit mental representation of things. Yeah, sure. I agree that many evidence will not involve proposition. For me, remember, propositions are sets of possible worlds, which are supposed to capture basically ways for the world to be. So as long as you're sort of correctly hooked up to the world, you can have those kinds of, like all evidence, on my view, is like propositional in that like very sort of thin sense that it's like hooked up to some state of the world.
Okay. Well, thanks very much, Nilanjan, for a lovely talk and a very engaging discussion session.
Thanks.
I think you made a challenging topic really accessible and also extremely interesting. So thanks a lot, and thanks to all of you who participated in today's session, who listened and asked questions and thought about what was talked about. We'll see hopefully all of you next week when we have Professor Prashanta Bandyopadhyay, who was with us until recently, but now I think he's no longer with us on this chat, but he will be giving a talk next week. So I hope to see all of you then. So yeah, thank you all for being here, and see you.
Thank you, everyone. Those were great questions. Thank you.